Welcome to NTD News. I'm Tiffany Meyer. Here are today's top stories. The World Health Organization is coming under scrutiny for its actions during the pandemic. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo saying when an organization says it works for the greater good, it has to deliver. New guidelines allow essential workers who have been exposed to the virus but aren't showing symptoms to return to work, as long as they take certain precautions. U.S. officials outraged as China is awarded a place on the UN's Human Rights Council. And U.S. and Russian astronauts are launching towards the International Space Station today. Questions are rising over whether the World Health Organization has lived up to its mission of keeping the world safe. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo says it is important that it delivers. The U.S. gives hundreds of millions of dollars to the organization each year.
President Trump on Wednesday doubled down on his claims that the U.S. was going to investigate the World Health Organization. He said the WHO made many errors relating to the virus. One central mistake was a statement they made on January 14th.
There was no human-to-human transmission. Well, there was. They probably made that statement in the second or third week of December in addition, but they made it very powerfully on January 14th.
In a tweet on January 14th, the WHO wrote, "Preliminary investigations conducted by the Chinese authorities have found no clear evidence of human-to-human transmission." But their official COVID-19 timeline shows that on the same day, the technical leader of the WHO's COVID-19 response said there had been limited human-to-human transmission of the coronavirus. The infectious diseases expert also said there was a risk of possible wider outbreak and that this outcome would not be surprising. More than a week later, the WHO concluded that there was human-to-human transmission of the virus, but they did not agree that it was a public health emergency of international concern, instead deciding to reconvene 10 days later to reassess. The World Health Organization is the directing and coordinating authority on international health within the United Nations system. The U.S. gives the most money in funding to the WHO than any other country. It contributed nearly $900 million to the organization's budget for 2018 to 2019. That represents one-fifth of its total $4.4 billion budget for those years. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo said Wednesday that organizations supported by taxpayers' money have to work.
They have to execute on the mission that they are designed to achieve. And we've seen, with respect to the World Health Organization, here we are. It hasn't accomplished what it was intended to deliver.
The WHO's mission is to promote health, keep the world safe, and serve the vulnerable. Pompeo also said just like every other nation, China has a special responsibility to deal with outbreaks and get it right quickly so they don't spread. GOPs raised their concerns about the WHO on Wednesday. Missouri Senator Josh Hawley called the organization's Director General a disgrace and accused the WHO of collaborating with the Chinese regime. Representative Guy Richantler wrote that the WHO needs to be held accountable.
A Harris poll survey shows 77% of Americans blame China for the pandemic. Chinese health officials first detected the CCP virus in Hubei province at the end of 2019, but waited for weeks to make the disease public. Trump administration officials and health experts believe the delay in reporting and attempted cover-up by the Chinese Communist regime allowed the epidemic to spread throughout China and become a global pandemic. Over 430,000 Americans are positive for the virus, and nearly 15,000 have died. And in a small step toward reopening the country, the CDC issued guidelines allowing essential workers who have been exposed to the CCP virus to go back to work, as long as they are feeling well and they take certain precautions.
The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention issued new guidance for essential workers who have been exposed to the CCP virus, also known as the coronavirus. CDC Director Robert Redfield said the employee can return to work as long as they take their temperature before they go to work, wear a face mask at all times, and practice social distancing in their workplace. He warned that people must not go back to work if they are sick. Other guidelines include advice about how to stay safe at work.
We want them not to share objects that would be touching their face, and we would like them not to congregate in break rooms, lunch rooms, and crowded places.
The new guidelines allow essential workers without any symptoms to go back to work instead of staying home because they've had exposure. Redfield said the guidelines apply to individuals that have been within 6 feet of a confirmed case or a suspected case of the virus. The guidelines also state that employers should check the temperature of employees and assess their symptoms before starting them back at work. Other guidelines include increasing airflow in the building and cleaning common areas more regularly. Anyone found to be unwell should be sent home immediately.
Within the next few weeks, American taxpayers will begin getting their stimulus checks. For some, it will be a lifeline. For others, padding for the time being. But what should you do with that money?
Part of the $2 billion stimulus package from the government may be going right into your pockets. And depending on how much you make and how many people are in your household, you could be receiving several $1,000s. With unemployment numbers skyrocketing and many others having their hours or wages cut, financial help cannot come soon enough. So what should you do with that cash? Money expert Susie Orman has some advice. First, don't go blowing it. Even if you are financially stable right now, a global pandemic is not the time to be making big purchases.
It's your job out there, everybody, to really make the most out of every penny that you have right now.
But what about those who are now unemployed or have bills they need to pay? The good news, Orman says, many of your creditors are willing to work with you.
Your mortgage companies, your credit card companies, the utility companies, all of you should go online to your service provider because the calls are just too much for them to take. And they will tell you there.
And when it comes to prioritizing your spending right now, here's Orman's advice. Make sure you have health care. Spend on food and shelter first. Don't borrow to pay bills. Only make the minimum payments right now. Save what you can from your stimulus check.
President Trump is standing his ground against widespread voting by mail. He's urging Republican lawmakers not to allow it this election season, citing voter fraud.
President Trump wrote on Twitter Wednesday that Republicans should fight very hard when it comes to statewide mail-in voting. He said Democrats are clamoring for it and that it has tremendous potential for voter fraud. In practice, mail-in voting circumnavigates some security measures. These are the only ballot cast without supervision by election officials. Some Senate Democrats say they plan to introduce a bill that would expand mail-in and early voting statewide. Among them, former presidential candidate Amy Klobuchar. She says Congress should ensure that every American has a safe way to participate in our democracy during a national emergency. The bill would make states send an absentee ballot to any voter who requests it online for any reason. If the voter doesn't receive it, they would be allowed to print out a special federal ballot, currently only allowed for overseas Americans and troops. It would also make states accept any absentee ballots postmarked or signed before the close of the polls on Election Day.
U.S. officials are outraged as China is awarded a place on the UN Human Rights Council. The representative will help choose who should investigate human rights abuses. Officials asking how that is possible, considering China itself is a serial human rights abuser.
U.S. officials are speaking out as China is awarded a place on the UN Human Rights Council. In a letter to the UN Secretary General, 7 senators questioning how China, a serial human rights abuser itself, could oversee the protection of human rights around the world. The CCP representative will help choose human rights investigators who will look at freedom of speech, enforced disappearance, and arbitrary detention, rights abuses which the Chinese regime routinely perpetrates. They say the regime's decision to cover up the CCP virus outbreak alone violates any credibility on human rights. Congressman Chris Smith highlighting even more serious abuses. There's a growing body of evidence that the Chinese government harvests the organs of political prisoners, providing organs on order for those willing to pay a blood price. An independent tribunal in the UK recently concluded that forced organ harvesting is carried out on religious minorities like Christians, Uyghur Muslims, and members of the persecuted spiritual practice Falun Gong. The Chinese regime has severely persecuted Falun Gong since 1999, with hundreds of thousands detained in prisons, labor camps, and brainwashing centers. The United States left the Human Rights Council in 2018, then UN Ambassador Nikki Haley calling it a protector of human rights abusers and a cesspool of political bias.
And in the UK, anger is growing over the Chinese regime and its attempts to cover up the CCP virus. Politicians warn that disinformation is costing lives. Our UK correspondent Jane Werrell has more.
The Chinese Communist Party failed to disclose vital information about the initial coronavirus outbreak and has breached international law, according to findings in a new report that says the Chinese regime should be sued.
We have to continue to apply pressure on the Chinese authorities to share all and every bit of information that they possess for the greater good of humanity. And if they show any unwillingness to do that, we need to make certain that they're held accountable.
The report, published by the UK foreign policy think tank Henry Jackson Society, says China could be liable to compensate the world's top 7 economies at least $4 trillion.
If you allow a rogue state like this get close to you, whether you are Iran or Britain, you're in trouble. Now we're in trouble because we have far too much in our setup already, which gives the Chinese pressure points that they can apply to us.
Several lawsuits have already been launched in the US, suing the regime for the economic damage the pandemic has caused to Americans. Some British lawmakers are criticising the CCP's initial cover-up of the pandemic. Politicians from the UK's Foreign Affairs Committee said that disinformation from China is costing lives. British politician Ian Duncan-Smith, former leader of the UK Conservative Party, says Chinese disinformation is happening on an enormous scale and their behaviour can no longer continue.
They seem now to be putting out misinformation all over the place about where this started, even trying to blame the United States. Some blamed Italy and said it's had an outbreak in September and didn't tell anybody. Many other countries have had enough of this behaviour by China, and it doesn't look like it's going to stop.
Unreliable figures and information from China means that the true scale of the tragedy within China remains unknown, as the virus continues to take lives and infect people both inside and outside of China. People here are wanting answers. Jane Werrell, NTD News, London.
Investigators boarded the Ruby Princess cruise ship in Australia today to seize the black box. It will be used as part of a homicide investigation into the country's deadliest source of CCP virus infections.
Zipped up in hazard suits, clad in masks and gloves, Australian police boarded the Ruby Princess cruise ship in Sydney on Wednesday. This is the vessel that let off hundreds of passengers infected with the coronavirus, 15 of which later died. Officers went in to retrieve the black box from the ship. New South Wales Police Commissioner Mick Fuller said the black box will be used as part of a homicide investigation. This ship, owned by Carnival Corporation, has become a flashpoint of public anger in Australia. Last month, authorities granted the ship permission to disembark passengers without health checks. It went on to become the country's deadliest source of infections. Fuller confirmed that about 1,000 crew of various nationalities remain on board the Ruby Princess. He also thanked Australians for bringing crew goods while they remain shipbound.
Local community, can I thank you?
On a positive note, the infections within Australia hit its lowest number in 3 weeks on Wednesday. It's prompted authorities to begin arranging more flights to bring home Australians stranded abroad.
Coming up, a German official questions China's fairy tale virus numbers. He says the regime's cover-up allowed it to spread around the world.
They were working on developing a coronavirus for the human host. Leads you to question, why would you be creating a coronavirus that can infect humans?
That means virus now can infect human cells much easier.
I noticed that after the outbreak, the Wuhan Institute of Virology kept strangely quiet. is the real boss of the P4 laboratory.
I believe they're developing them. I think they want to be the most advanced nation on earth when it comes to biological weapons.
We want the truth.
It's time for the United States to defend itself. The real disease here is communism.
What was the Chinese Communist Party trying to hide?
Wuhan opened its borders yesterday after 2 months of lockdown, but many residents are still afraid as asymptomatic cases keep rising. NTD Shiwen Rong has the story.
While Chinese state media shows a celebration of Wuhan's borders reopening after 2 months of lockdown, some areas are still restricted. A netizen posted a video saying on April 8th, the Hanhua community in Wuhan was sealed shut again and people were not allowed to leave. There are new suspected cases of infection. On the same day, videos circulated showing an unconscious person lying on the ground on a street in Wuhan. Police and people in full protective suits look on. Official reports show that some communities in Wuhan have asymptomatic carriers, but the Chinese regime isn't counting them as confirmed cases. On April 6th, state-run media Xinhua quoted the Hubei provincial government, saying that in Wuhan, 70 residential areas lost their virus-free designation after authorities detected asymptomatic carriers living there. A Wuhan resident told us lifting quarantine doesn't change people's freedom much. It mostly affects citizens working outside Wuhan. For a resident to leave their homes to work, they need a special certificate from their company to let them leave and return into the residential area. Another certificate is needed to go buy groceries, and they can only stay out for a maximum of 2 hours. They say these restrictions will last till the end of April. As more and more asymptomatic carriers are detected, some China analysts worry that a larger outbreak may be unavoidable, especially since the epicenter has opened its borders and Wuhan authorities are encouraging people to go back to work. Reporting by Shiwen Rong, NTD News.
There's a rush to make face masks in China, but where are they being made and how is the quality?
The world is scrambling for medical supplies, including face masks. As the world's factory, Chinese factories are flooded with orders. But while demand is high, residents say the quality is low.
I don't dare to use these masks made nowadays. From what I know, many small businesses now started making face masks. They just got some equipment in small factories and can now produce 50 to 60,000 per day.
According to a business data company in China, nearly 5,500 new companies registered to produce face masks between late January and mid-March. But one mask exporter says many manufacturers just switch from making clothing or electronics and they lack certification. He estimates that 60% don't have sterile environments. One factory he went to was full of dust and workers weren't wearing masks or gloves. Mr. Chiang told us it's the same where he works.
It's impossible for the production environment to be clean and sterile.
Since the end of March, Chinese customs seized over 11 million pieces of faulty medical supplies. The majority were face masks. According to AFP, almost 4 billion masks have been exported since March 1st. But the quality is questionable. The Netherlands recalled 600,000 masks imported from China. Some didn't protect the face and some had bad filters. Millions of masks sent to Austria at the end of March were also faulty. Until recently, the U.S. did not accept Chinese-made high-protection KN95 masks. But given the domestic shortages, they can now be imported.
European politicians say the Chinese Communist Party is trying to change the narrative around the CCP virus, but they are not buying it. NTD's Germany correspondent Christian Watchen has the details.
After almost 11 weeks on lockdown, authorities in Wuhan are lifting all travel restrictions. For the past several weeks, the CCP has reported 0 or near 0 new infections in the whole of China. But not everyone is convinced the epidemic is truly over.
That the Chinese had supposedly already fought the epidemic. I think this is a fairy tale of the central government in Beijing, which in turn shows what a communist dictatorship does in terms of propaganda to the outside world. This reminds me heavily of Chernobyl.
Criticism is growing over the CCP's failing to contain the virus. Some politicians in Europe point out how Chinese authorities knew about it early on, and how they destroyed virus samples, detained citizen journalists, and silenced doctors who tried to sound the alarm.
Already in November, the first reports within China were forwarded to Beijing and to the health authorities that there is a new lung disease. And typical for a system like China's, which is not democratic and pluralistically set up, they therefore first tried to cover it up.
A study found that if the Chinese regime had acted just 3 weeks earlier, 95% of infections could have been prevented.
If we had had 6 weeks lead time, if the WHO had already issued a warning at the end of November, we would probably not have many thousands of deaths on our books. China must be held accountable.
As countries in Europe continue to struggle with the pandemic and its fallout, some observers see it as a chance to gain more clarity on the CCP's true nature and its intentions. Reporting by Christian Watchin, NTD News, Berlin.
Coming up, rideshare drivers are making much less since lockdown. But after the break, we'll see why this driver stays on the road.
Viewers have described China Uncensored like The Daily Show, but about China.
At the beginning, I was super excited when I got 500 views, and now the show's grown to about 500,000 subscribers on YouTube. One episode reached 7.9 million people. I'm a little freaked out that that many people have seen my face. In 5 years, I see China Uncensored as the sole source of edutainment worldwide.
Starbucks is stepping up, committing $10 million to help out people in their company affected by the virus. It's all part of a new Global Partner Emergency Relief Program. The company talked about it Wednesday, saying it'll help cover expenses for housing and utilities, or if someone loses their home. It'll even help with funeral expenses, just to name a few of the ways they want to chip in. The CPO for Starbucks, Lucy Helm, says the company believes it's their responsibility to help their employees who are struggling right now. And rideshare drivers' income is down 80% across the country. Many drivers are off the road altogether to protect against health risks. But this one in New York is still helping essential workers get where they need to go. NTD's Kevin Hogan has the story.
Across the country, rideshare drivers losing about 80% of their income due to lockdowns caused by the pandemic. For-hire vehicles are an essential business. Raul, a registered taxi and limousine commission or TLC driver, is hitting the streets. He doesn't turn away any passengers coming or going from the hospital.
I don't panic when I go to a hospital and I'm picking somebody up. I just pick them up. I don't discriminate. I just pick up. Doesn't matter where they're going. I just pick them up.
He doesn't advise anyone to do what he does, but he says he chooses to do it because it feels good to help his fellow New Yorkers.
So we went over to Far Rockaway. We delivered the asthma medication, stood there for a few minutes, and I brought her right back to the Bronx, and she was thankful.
Many rideshare drivers calling it quits to protect their health, and some because there just aren't enough fares. Raul says the city has lost doctors, nurses, police officers, and taxi drivers to the virus.
All New Yorkers. That's what we're losing. We're losing New Yorkers. And I feel, I get emotional when I talk about it like that because I'm one. I'm not Superman. It can happen to me too.
Some New Yorkers say the safest way to travel is on foot, bicycle, or taxi to avoid crowds.
If you have to travel, I think walking would be the best way, obviously keeping a 6-foot distance. But if you're going to do something, maybe a bicycle.
The trains are really a pain in the neck right now because they cut the service drastically, so every train I've been on in the past 2 weeks has been overcrowded.
One woman who recovered from the virus now works from home.
Like I lost my sense of smell and taste and had some breathing issues, all the stuff. So my husband got it as well, so.
Raul says now that less cars are on the street and less police are out patrolling, more motorists are speeding. As a member of Families for Safe Streets and as a crash survivor, he asked them to stop driving recklessly and for pedestrians to be safe when they're out so that we don't send more to the hospital. Thanks, Raul. Kevin Hogan, NTD News reporting.
They are the least comfortable seats on the airplane, and now Delta isn't even booking them anymore. The middle seats. It's an effort to create a little more distance between passengers to try and prevent the spread of the virus. No middle seats through the end of May. And they're also going to put a pause on automatic advanced seat upgrades to make sure people have enough space. Delta and other airlines have been slashing schedules with fewer and fewer people flying. And coming up, seniors unable to leave their apartments because of the CCP virus celebrate and dance on their balconies. See how they make the best of a difficult time after the break. A U.S.-Russian space crew blasted off this morning from Kazakhstan to the International Space Station. It was a notable exception to the many events canceled recently due to the pandemic.
NASA astronaut Chris Cassidy, Roscosmos cosmonauts Anatoly Ivanishin and Ivan Wagner took off for Expedition 63 to the International Space Station. As a sign of these difficult times, those involved in the launch were all seen keeping 6 feet apart and wearing masks. However, many health and safety precautions are already standard practice for astronauts traveling to space. NASA quarantines all crew members for 2 weeks before they launch to prevent them being ill in outer space. The 6-hour flight is the 3rd trip for Cassidy and Ivanishin, but the 1st for Wagner. The crew will join the Expedition 62 commander of Roscosmos and 2 NASA flight engineers who are scheduled to return on April 17th.
Residents of a retirement community in California are having a lot of fun every day, even while they do social distancing from their apartments.
After weeks of being cooped up at home because of the deadly CCP virus, elderly residents of a retirement community in the Californian beach town of La Jolla have something to look forward to with daily pep rallies on their balconies.
These are resident employee pep rallies that we do daily in order to feel community spirit and to let residents know that we miss them.
It's a way for residents to get some exercise and a boost for their spirits. Workers at this sprawling V at La Jolla Village Retirement Complex entice residents onto their balconies and lead them through a dance routine. At this pep rally on Wednesday, residents could be seen dancing and waving American flags from their balconies before being read the Pledge of Allegiance.
And I think that they're very thankful for the opportunity to get out and see one another and see us. And we've been having a great time doing it, and we've gotten great feedback from them.
The elderly are especially vulnerable in the pandemic. Health officials and governments are increasingly calling for more measures to keep them safe.
What a sweet story. And that's all for now. Thanks for tuning in. Catch up again at 6:30 p.m. Eastern Time. I'm Tiffany Meyer.